I would say that no matter who you are and what you perceive your own identity to be, how society treats you, you can't make a difference sitting on your couch. Your government won't change, your life won't change. That's true in every realm. And this is something that people die for in other countries around the world still. And we have the privilege of doing it safely.
This is the Visible Voices podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Resa Lewis. In today's episode, I am delighted to bring you my conversation with a political visible voice, a leader, a professor, an American democracy subject matter expert, Professor Wendy Schiller of Brown University. Now, in this conversation, we cover the professional journey of Wendy. We talk about her co-authored book along with Kaitlin Sidorsky entitled Inequality Across State Lines. And finally, we're less than 100 days away. It's Civic Health Month. We're going to talk about the presidential election. A little bit of background on Wendy. She grew up in Long Island. She studied at the University of Chicago. She worked as a legislative assistant in the Senate for Daniel P. Moynihan of New York. She then worked for Governor Mario M. Cuomo as a lobbyist in D.C. for the state of New York. She earned a PhD at the University of Rochester, completed fellowships at the Brookings Institute and Princeton, and she made her way up to Providence to join Brown University 30 years ago in 1994. Now, a brief trigger warning, audience. In this episode, we do talk about domestic violence and death by firearms. You can turn the episode off at any time and come back whenever you wish. Let's get to the conversation. Professor Wendy J. Schiller, thanks for joining me on the Visible Voices podcast.
My pleasure to be here, Resa.
You've been described as one of the nation's most distinguished scholars of Congress, of American political history and democracy, and renowned for your expertise on the U.S. Senate. How does that feel?
Well, I think everybody wants to feel as if their voice can be heard. And it's been a great pleasure to pursue my passion, which is American politics, and in particular, spending most of my career thinking about the dynamics of the United States Senate, the modern Senate, and the historic Senate. So that's just been great luck on my part that I could translate my passion into a career.
At Brown, you teach or have taught courses on the American presidency, Introduction to the American Political Process, Philosophy of the Founding. In addition, author of many papers and 5 books, one that just dropped, and we're going to be speaking about that later in the program. What would you say threads these courses and these books that you have written?
The fundamental point of interest for me has always been representation. So when we think about the 17th Amendment, that was changing the Constitution, and there's lots of conversations today about how we might change the Constitution to make our system more democratic, little d, more fair, more representative. The argument about the 17th Amendment was the same, and it was a long time ago that it was adopted, 1913. But nonetheless, the argument was if we directly elect U.S. senators as opposed to having them selected in state legislatures, then we will have a greater say over our senators' behavior and they'll be more responsive to our basic needs. Basically, the job of a senator has changed a lot, but the relationship hasn't really changed as much as people would like. Senators are still fairly far removed from the average voter in their states, even in a small state like Rhode Island. It's a little bit better because of the proximity you can have to a senator. But nonetheless, the institution has not changed dramatically in who it serves and its policymaking. And we changed the Constitution to change the way we elected senators. So it's just a bit of a warning call to those who would think we can sort of fix our democracy by just amending the Constitution. I think a lot more has to come with it to make that happen.
And that's a perfect segue into Brown University. Now, many in our audience may not be familiar with your role and the work you do in the institute you direct in Rhode Island. This year in Rhode Island News Today, it was announced that you are the Allison Ressler Professor of Political Science, the interim Howard R. Swearer Director of the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs, and Director of the Taubman Center for American Politics and Policy. What does that all mean?
It's not unusual for senior full professors to do a number of different jobs, if you will, at Brown. I'm really pleased to hold the title of Allison Ressler Professor of Political Science because Allison Ressler is a very successful career woman in her own right and funded the chair. And so it's a little bit extra for me being a senior female in my profession. to have a title and a chair that is funded through the efforts of a successful career woman. So that's been a really great honor. So I also lead the Taubman Center for American Politics and Policy, which I've done for 3 years. And that involves basically trying to really make it the center for students and the public who want to discuss American politics at Brown. So we have weekly lunches, the public is invited, we have speaker series, and it's just to make sure that in this very broad and vast campus that we have, that there is a place that people who love American politics can come and engage with each other and engage with Brown alums. We have a lot of successful alums from Brown in American politics today. So we try to bring them to campus. And if not, we can't do that. We do it through Zoom. But then the students can connect with alums, but also really see policymakers in action. So that's really fun. All my jobs are fun. Recently, I was named interim director of the Watson Institute because it is going to be a school of international and public affairs as of July 1st, 2025. And as many of you out there know, that when you're transitioning an organization to something that's already successful to another level, frequently you need a year of transition just to sort of do some reorganization, really see what your assets are, your strengths are, work on your weaknesses. So that's the job that Brown's asked me to do, and I'm happy to do it.
Yeah, it's super exciting as an alum, but also just to know what's happening in Providence, in Rhode Island, and your role in it. There are a lot of accomplishments that have come down the line in terms of the Watson Institute. One is the Masters of Public Affairs Policy Equity Scholars Program. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
So we said this is a new development for us. We have had a master's program in public affairs for some time. It has revamped and ramped up in recent years, attracting more students, admitting more students, and placing students in jobs across the country and sometimes internationally. So what we have not been able to do thus far, though, is really target students who come from backgrounds that may not have all the advantages of sort of a typical Brown student or a typical student applying for a master's in public affairs. So the Policy Equity Scholars Program is really designed to attract and enable students from those backgrounds to attend, get their master's, finance their master's, and really experience all the benefits of the program. So we're excited to launch it. So our first class will come from this year's applicants, and we'll launch also July 1st, 2025.
Super exciting. You gave a hat tip to yourself, I'll say, about being a woman leader in your position, in your subject matter expertise, and it's not typically seen. Adding to that, Barbara Sinclair, in 2021, you actually received the Barbara Sinclair Lecture Award. I'm wondering if you can share with the listeners, who is she and what did that award mean to you?
Barbara Sinclair was a trailblazer in political science. Her original married name is Deckard, and then she went to Sinclair, and she got her PhD in the very early 1970s when there were very few women who were studying legislative politics or who were accepted as scholars in legislative politics. And she spent most of her career, if not all of her career, in California. And as other male scholars were emerging from the same program, the University of Rochester PhD program, of which I am also an alum, that decade produced phenomenal scholarship in this area and a lot of prominent male scholars. And she was out there making her name, making her way, becoming quite prominent as early as 1978. And then certainly in 1989, releasing a book called The Transformation of the American Senate, of the U.S. Senate. And that was a blockbuster book. And she really was a trailblazer and a leader. And so this prize, there's actually 2 different prizes named after her. And I received one of them. And it made me very proud to think that I could have followed in that tradition.
Huge congrats. Did you ever meet her?
Oh, yes. No, I mean, I interacted with her my entire career. And in the first years of my career, she was a little bit skeptical of my topic. I was writing a dissertation on why senators introduce bills at all and what subjects they choose, how far those bills progress in the legislative process, and really trying to get into the decision-making of senators and their offices, their staff. As of yet, very few people had looked at that particular topic. More scholars think about the voting records of members of the Senate rather than their legislative portfolios. But I had worked in the United States Senate for a man named Daniel Patrick Moynihan. If anyone takes the train to New York, they'll recognize the name if they get off Amtrak in Moynihan Station. And I had been fascinated and involved in that process. So I wanted to study it systematically. So she was a bit of a skeptic in the beginning. And then when I wanted to study how senators from the same state interact, systematically across all states to see what voters get out of having two senators from their state instead of one. She warmed up a little bit. And then by the time I got to the 17th Amendment, she was definitely on my side at that point in time. So I had to earn her respect, and I'm glad that I did. And she passed away some years ago. So I'm glad that we could have connected as colleagues before that happened.
Yeah, I have a similar story of a mentor, someone to whom I really looked up, sort of disagreed with a career move I made, but it felt right. I trusted my gut. And years later, circle back, he said, Resa, I was wrong. I was wrong. And so it's not the exact same, but it sounds very similar. It's kind of hard to go against the grain when it's someone you trust, someone you respect, someone who's a mentor telling you that they're not completely on board with what you would like to pursue in terms of study.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing, I think, for women as they go through the years of their careers, in and out of particular careers, switching careers. Who do you trust? Who do you seek as mentors? I was fortunate to have the same mentor she had, who was still actively teaching and guiding graduate students, Richard Fenno. And so that was a bit of a plus for me, but I still had to prove myself to her. And there were two other women, Diana Evans and Linda Fowler, also of that generation from my program, who were really active supporters of mine, but also tough on me. And their belief was that in those days, and even today, you could argue that being a woman meant that you just had to be as good, if not better, than everybody else, particularly men. And so that if you went off the ranch, meaning if you tried to pursue a scholarly path that wasn't mainstream, the male-dominated field wouldn't give you the attention that you needed to forge your career. So I think that was the concern. I did as you did. I ignored that concern and eventually won over a good deal of the field. But it took maybe longer than it should have. But, you know, when you decide you're passionate and you fall in love with a topic and you want to pursue it, then you have to take those risks. And so that's what I did.
It's a perfect time to bring up your voice. When did you realize that you had a voice, and when did you start using that voice, be it written, be it public policy, be it otherwise?
Well, I'm not sure how many listeners know the sort of trajectory of an academic or a professor's track, but you're hired as what's called an assistant professor. And if you're in a tenured line position, then eventually they send out your file to all these scholars in the field and they write anonymous letters about you and say you have promised to be a really good scholar or you don't. I did get tenure at Brown. And at that point, you sort of think you can find your voice, but there's still another layer, another step, which is to become a full professor, which means that you've sort of left your graduate advisor behind. You're really on your own. And what can you produce all by yourself or with other colleagues, but as an equal to those colleagues? So it's a whole nother layer and another 6. And in my case, much more than that, like 10 or 12, 14 years to get to full professor. So there were some setbacks in that career trajectory for me. But when I finally did publish the 17th Amendment book with a man named Charles Stewart from MIT, that's when I thought, okay, now I have a voice. And my voice is full and my voice merits consideration, that I can be heard now fully on the same plane as my colleagues. And everybody gets to that moment at a different point in their scholarly career. But I think the last 10 years have been a time when I felt most confident with my voice.
I love that. And relatedly, I've listened to some other podcasts you've been on, read some of your works. You've spoken a bit about women and how we self-regulate language. Now, part of it is societal/community. And you have a kind of funny story about this may be a dumb question, but do you want to share that story with the audience?
This is a pretty good story. 1996, so I wasn't tenured yet. And I had been selected to go to this terrific conference, actually in Salzburg, Austria. It was an amazing opportunity. And everybody was running American politics was there. Karl Rove, who was advisor to then Governor George Bush. It was Ralph Reed, Christian Coalition. It was just so many different people. Susan Estridge, who had run a presidential campaign. So all these really famous people, quite intimidated actually. So I wanted to ask Ralph Reed about building up the Christian Coalition, which was the sort of inheritor from the moral majority. And we would think a little bit associated with the Tea Party today. And I wanted to ask how he did it. And I had an idea. And I checked with Karl Rove whether it was a good question. And he said, yes, that's a very good question. And so I asked him, but before I did, I said, this may be a dumb question, which women, frankly, do more than men, which female students sometimes do more than male students, even today. And I asked it. I got a really good answer from Ralph Reed. And then Karl Rove took me aside and said, I'm very disappointed in you. You are an assistant professor in an Ivy League school. Why would you ever preface your remarks with, this may be a dumb question? And then the kicker was, he then said, and besides, I told you it was a good question. So you should have had faith in my judgment. But I never forgot that. And after that, I never did it again. And I think it's so important for women to remember that if you preface your contributions with doubt, then people will have doubt in what you are saying.
Have you forgiven yourself?
Oh, yes, I forgive myself. You know how people can sometimes have a sensitivity to a sound or a tone of voice or pitch or a word? Whenever I hear anybody doing this, now male or female or non-binary, I say stop. And if it's a student in particular, I stop. I say to them, listen, you ask your question. If I don't think it's a great question I'll let you know, but don't start at a disadvantage. I always start with a point of confidence. And it is something we have to continually remind ourselves to do.
Inequality across state lines, how policymakers have failed domestic violence victims in the United States. I want to read briefly for listeners who are not familiar with the book. In the United States, 1 in 4 women will be victims of domestic violence every year. Despite the passage of federal legislation on violence against women beginning in 1994, differences in how domestic violence is addressed persist across states. How are you different having written this book?
Oh, Resa, that's a really important question, I think, again, as a woman, but also as a scholar. I had always focused my academic and scholarly career on the U.S. Congress, particularly the United States Senate, but also a textbook on introductory politics, American politics. And I had not written anything on gender and politics or women's security. And because I had ascended to full professor, I was chair of my department. I had a graduate student, my PhD student, who had finished her dissertation on women in politics. And she wanted to write more. And I thought, we always conceive of equality for women in terms of pay equity and wages, very important, but also abortion rights, reproductive rights, even more important now than ever. But we hadn't really thought about the way that states and their policies actually empower women, make them physically safer or economically better off, and how that differs from state to state in the United States of America, as opposed to Europe, where they have consistent policies, throughout a single country. So I wanted to look at equality in a way that really drilled down into the daily lives that women lead. That led us to the idea of human security.
I love that you shared this. And when you and I first met, I remember thinking, how am I going to convince her that we have something to talk about? Because we had never met in person. I knew about you. And one of the areas that I shared where we have overlap is this interest in equity and gender equity and health, specifically civic health. You shared domestic violence was not always a crime or a public health issue. This may or may not be surprising to listeners. It used to be considered a private matter. What I love is that you have said that domestic violence is a comprehensive public health and criminal justice issue that prevents women from living their fullest, most equal lives in America, and federalism is one cause. Can you walk us through federalism and actually explain why you feel so strongly that it actually is a public health and criminal justice issue?
The federal system that we have is that the federal government passes laws and they're supposed to be, quote unquote, supreme, the supremacy clause in the Constitution. But states implement laws. And so what will happen is that the federal government, some things are their purview. Immigration, for example, is a federal purview. States don't have, according to U.S. Arizona and the Supreme Court, don't have legal rights to enforce immigration. But in terms of lots of other measures, the states have their own laws and they implement. And so for women's security and domestic violence, for example, we didn't even have any laws really on the books until really honestly till early 1990s. The first domestic violence shelter was established in 1978. The first legislation even to deal with this is 1978, but it didn't make it a crime. It was really a social service, a private matter. And so when the federal government passes a law like the Violence Against Women Act of 1994, originally sponsored by current President Biden when he was a senator, when that passes, everyone thinks, oh, okay, all the states follow this federal law. That is not what happens. The federal law, and if you are prosecuted by federal prosecutors, can apply to you, and states are supposed to follow it, but really they need to actually pass their own laws that mimic or mirror the federal law in order for the state attorney general or state police or any kind of criminal justice or social service people to actually implement the same policy. And so we have seen sort of a really slow trickle since 1994 of states passing laws on their own that comply with this act, which made it an actual federal crime to commit domestic violence. Now, technically, you have to cross state lines to be prosecuted by the federal government, but it laid out the whole rubric that said this is a crime and states should join us in treating it like a crime.
Yeah. It sounds horrendous that it is only recently that it was considered a crime.
The medical system is geared towards men. And also the criminal justice system is geared towards men. And of course, we have the problem of mass incarceration and over-incarceration and racial disparities in our criminal justice system. And that does intersect with domestic violence. If you are of color, you might be more likely to be arrested. We know for sure that if you're a woman of color and you call for help, we've seen most recently where that can go terribly wrong. But in a domestic violence incident, you may be arrested alongside the perpetrator. Whereas if you're a white woman, you won't be arrested. So these are still really horrible racial disparities. However, we still have the proximate cause of homicide and injury to women coming from abusive partners, and removing the woman from that environment or the abuser from that environment is the difference in saving lives, as you well know too from your background in medicine.
Yeah. 50% of women who die by domestic violence die by firearm, which is part of why you and your co-author focused on firearms. One of the things I've been meaning to note is in speaking with you and watching you speak, you are able to roll off names, dates, laws, stats, similar to someone who reads the sports pages and can read sports stats. This is you with politics and government and laws and elections. And I want to know, when did you first appreciate that about yourself?
I don't know if I appreciated it about myself, but I've always, since I was really young, 9 years old, I liked history and politics. I always had a voracious appetite for knowledge about it. I think writing a textbook on American politics with my co-authors, John Geer, and Jeff Siegel, and Richard Herrera, doing that. And that first edition started in 2006. I was teaching Intro to American Politics, and I started to write the book. The first edition didn't even publish till 2011. But nonetheless, that is every aspect of American government. And once you're used to having to be informed about all of American government, you teach it, you write about it, you start to absorb and keep track of things that you never thought that you would. And it's constant updating, which is a great challenge for me, but I do love it. So I think it's just a great pleasure and luxury to be in a profession where I can accumulate knowledge all the time, and then I can regurgitate it and try to teach people about it later on.
Yeah, I do describe it as like a hunger and being hungry. And so I love that you said voracious appetite very much. I love that because it's infectious for someone that maybe it's not your subject matter expertise. It's not my subject matter expertise, but it makes me hungry for it, to understand it, to get that knowledge. And also, basically, now you have all this stored knowledge on your hard drive, and then there's more stuff that gets added to your desktop and gets downloaded. Back to the book, you cite the 1994 Violence Against Women Act, and then 2 years later, Congress passed the Lautenberg Amendment, which, correct me if I'm wrong, prevents domestic violence misdemeanants from purchasing or possessing a firearm. How is that related to what you cover in the book?
Well, in the book, we look at the pace and the content of the laws that states passed, starting actually in 1990 and 1991, all the way through 2017, and track how they align with the federal law. And so to do that, we track how they align with the VAWA Act of 1994, which actually prohibits, it's a federal crime, to give someone under a restraining order for domestic violence or been convicted of domestic violence a gun. So it actually de facto makes it illegal for those individuals to be possessing or owning a gun. And that was a felony. So be convicted of domestic violence felony, which is a pretty high level charge. And most prosecutors don't charge domestic violence offenders with a felony unless it's severe assault or murder. And sometimes they just charge them with murder. So we don't even count it as domestic violence. So we wanted to look at the states and what they said about domestic violence and firearms. And that's what led us in that direction. The Lautenberg Amendment is absolutely crucial. The vast majority of domestic violence crimes are prosecuted as misdemeanors. If you've been convicted of a misdemeanor domestic violence offense, you cannot have a gun. You cannot possess it. You can't own it. If you are under a restraining order, a final restraining order, by the way, not an ex parte temporary one, but a final one, many states have a time limit lapse on that. In other words, you'll get a final restraining order, but it'll only be good for 2 years. Then your former abuser can get a gun again. So that's a real inconsistency across state lines. The most important decision in our realm this year of the Supreme Court is Rahimi, which came down in June from the Supreme Court, which upheld 8-1 the provision in VAWA that says that people under restraining order cannot possess or own a gun. That literally will save women's lives. And it was a very strong sign of support issued by the Supreme Court. They had upheld VAWA and this provision in 3 different prior cases. But as you know, the Supreme Court has been throwing out precedent lately. So we didn't know how they would go. And now they have reaffirmed it. And literally, it will keep women safer in America.
Yeah. What I really love is you and your co-author highlight the nuance of laws and the nuance of actually bringing criminals to trial or to punishment. And specifically, you mentioned and referenced this just now, this concept of dual arrest. I'm going to name a few more, and I'd love you to go into whichever ones you select. Boyfriend loophole, specifically how this is particularly difficult for Native American communities. And finally, this concept of technology and that technology can actually make this more difficult in terms of protecting women.
Yeah, so Resa, I really want to stress to those people who might be in a dating relationship, who are not what we call common law spouses or married or share a child in common, because those are the traditional state definitions of a domestic domicile, which give you extra protections under domestic violence laws. So dating partners, a lot of states, not that many, but just about half of the states have laws already on the books that expand the definition and prohibition on gun ownership to individuals who are in a dating relationship who've been convicted of domestic violence or under a restraining order. But the federal government had never closed that loophole. And what happened was the Violence Against Women Act, led by the late, she just died, Sheila Jackson Lee of Houston, Congresswoman, she got that through, that bill, in 2022, both chambers. But they had to drop the boyfriend loophole closure on firearms due to opposition in the Senate. After the tragic shooting in Uvalde, where we had elementary school students and teachers killed, that in June of that year, the Congress passed the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. And in that bill, Senator Lisa Murkowski, Republican of Alaska, included the closure of the boyfriend loophole. So it is now federal law that prohibits dating partners under a restraining order or convicted of domestic violence from owning or possessing a gun. So that's really important for women to understand who are in dating relationships. And it's taken far too long to close that loophole. And then subsequent states following through on passing laws to reinforce that federal law. That's the next step in the next frontier for us.
Yeah. The role of technology and how technology can actually make it more difficult for women that are trying to get out of abusive relationships.
So I want to cover 2 things sort of at once. Technology, we all think, oh, it's great, except if you're in a household where you have a family plan on your cell phone, for example, and you've in prior years agreed to let your spouse or your partner see your text messages or put a tracker on your phone. Where's my phone? You can find me. And the problem is, how do you undo that? If you are in a household with either physical or psychological abuse, coercive control, meaning the partner, typically the man, but not always, controls all the finances and controls access to your bank account, your ATM. If you use the ATM, they can see that you've used it and where you are. So all of these technological advances have actually made women less safe, and it's harder to hide. So it's really important to know where your domestic violence shelters are in your community, to try to reach out and by all means tell family and friends if there's any inkling that you feel unsafe. We have a lot of cases, and then literally tell them, don't text them, don't call them, try to see them in person and tell them. We have a lot of cases where people will say, we never thought there was a problem, we didn't see it coming. We've had those cases in Rhode Island. And then we have other cases where there's been estrangement and the woman has, for financial reasons, had to stay in the home with their estranged abuser. And we just had a recent tragic shooting in that case where the woman was murdered and the abuser killed himself. These are really horrible incidences. So understanding that even the slightest thing that concerns you, telling a relative, telling somebody, we know that law enforcement can have fraught relationships with communities. We know that well. We know there's some abuse among law enforcement community members of their partners. It's a complicated world, but the more people you tell and don't use technology to do it, then hopefully the safer you could be if you had to leave the household.
Thanks for sharing that. And also, I really appreciate that you and your co-author emphasize this concept of it's a privilege to say, why don't you just leave the abuser? That there's so much more nuance and so much more to it that makes it difficult. I actually see this as a transition for us to bring us up to date 2024 It's less than 100 days till the election. And there is this element, some people are suffering from fascist fever and the authoritarianism that we have going on. Before we go right to you, Professor Wendy J. Schiller, as Politico, I want to give the audience a little bit background of your role in having a voice in this space. You're known to many Rhode Islanders by your prowess as a media commentator. You're a weekly contributor to WPRO with Gene Valicenti. You're on local national NPR affiliates. You've contributed to The Guardian, AFP, Bloomberg News, and so much more. Your voice is a visible voice. Unsurprisingly, you're on the Visible Voices podcast. So where are you right now? A scale of 1 to 10, 1 being not at all optimistic, 10 optimistic. Where are you today?
In terms of believing in the American system of democracy, I'm always optimistic. This comes from being a little kid who loved politics and believes in representation. Just like with the medical profession, Resa, I'm sure that you have told so many people and the people you treat and the people you work with that knowledge is power. And sort of taking that to the political realm. Understand where you're getting your information from. It's hard to get a single source of information that's clear these days. So we have to do some comparison shopping. When somebody says they say, always ask who they is so you have an idea of where they're coming from. And don't shut people out. You know, if somebody uses disempowering language to you or about other people, you may not want to interact with them again. But if they just disagree with you politically and support, the other side, if you shut them out, then the gulf just gets bigger and bigger and you lose any capacity to persuade them. So I'm always encouraging people to stick in it, stick with it. For example, we just talked about violence against women. We've talked about disempowered communities, underrepresented communities, and Native American communities that have their own set of issues, particularly when it comes to domestic violence. There's progress in these communities. There's progress. The Congress still passes laws and there is implementation of these laws. And we've just had something that allows tribal nations to try their own cases for domestic violence, even when the perpetrator is a non-native person. That is a big change in federal law. It's been expanded now. These are the things that keep people safer. But checking out does not make your community healthier, better, or safer. And so I think this is why we have to stay in it, even when you're like, oh, I can't listen to another piece of news. There's always a way to consume news. And I encourage everybody to do that. So, and I think this podcast is really helpful as well, because you have such a great range of perspectives from people who are really walking in different paths in life. But we are all one community. Remember, if you travel and you sit on an airplane, the first question you ask your seatmate is not what political party they belong to or who they're voting for. And just remember that there are forces out there, political parties, for example, social media companies that really make money off division. So the best we can to try to stay local and forge bonds together, I think the safer we are as a nation.
I actually have a note about how you sort of bring about positive energy on a daily basis. And you talk about smiling, saying hello. I do the same thing. So many different pieces that you just shared that I want to close and tie up a nice, pretty bow. So on an optimism rating scale, if the 1, not at all optimistic, 10, the most optimistic, do you feel comfortable committing to a number today, or you don't want to really go anywhere with a number?
I am definitely between a 7 and an 8 on the optimism scale. I do think that the switch from Joe Biden, if you look at other presidential first 3-year records, 3.5-year records, he has a very strong legislative record. You may not love his policies or disagree with them or agree with them, but he was successful in getting them through. So in that sense, turning to Harris reinvigorates, I think, sectors of our society and in the constituencies that Obama invigorated, but also Hillary Clinton invigorated. So you've got somebody of color, somebody of an immigrant background, somebody who's a woman. You have a lot of touchstones to get people paying attention again and back in the game. And everybody's vote is their own. But the more people who are energized, whatever side they are, the safer, I think, democracy is.
Yeah. I was listening to a podcast today where Cornell Belcher said that Kamala Harris as vice president is the most famous unknown person in the country.
Interesting. It will work to her advantage to sort of veer away slightly from Biden, but because she's so different in every part of her identity than Biden, it's not as hard to do as if she were a white male running in his place. And she has had a stump speech that she's been using that's quite similar, right? The same stump speech. And if she sticks with that, that's what she will be known for. It's when you diverge from the stump speech and make offhand comments, then people start to say, wait, I'm confused. I'm not quite sure what she stands for. So sticking with that core 20-minute speech is going to be important for her.
Some people have noted the similarities between 1968 and 2024. You're a numbers and a names and a history buff. The Democratic convention was in Chicago in 68. It's going to be in Chicago this year. LBJ decided not to run. Biden decided not to run. What do you think about the similarities and differences between 68 and 24?
So in 1968, we had international conflict, the Vietnam War, that incited a lot of passion, opposition, and support. We have the Israeli-Gaza conflict, which may or may not extend. That's incited a lot of opposition and a lot of support from different constituencies, particularly in the Democratic Party. So there is that parallel, and there is the risk for the Democrats of demonstrations that may or may not get out of hand. And that's the visual, particularly with social media, that everybody will see. So that is a risk for the Democrats. Having Kamala Harris as the nominee, I think brings an element of surprise to that parallel, because there would not have been a Black woman nominee. Barbara Jordan was around, Shirley Chisholm was around in the 1968 convention. But it wasn't until the 1970s that the Democratic Party thought about giving Black Democrats more of a standard role in their delegations from the South, for example, making sure it was best represented. So this was not then yet. So you had a primarily male-dominated white convention in Chicago in 1968. And that convention in 2024 will not be white male-dominated in 2024. And I think that is crucial to remember. And if she can shift the energy from protest to positivity, she will have accomplished something pretty remarkable in a short period of time.
Do you have any perspective on the role and safety of poll workers and voter intimidation for this election?
I am concerned about the poll worker situation and safety. We've had a number of people who used to volunteer for this job who don't want to do it anymore because of the combination of sort of the vitriol in American politics, but also social media. Used to be you'd go and put your ID, or you wouldn't even have to have an ID. Now you do in Rhode Island. You'd vote, but you didn't really remember who the poll worker was. Now people can snap pictures, they can find their social media accounts, and it becomes quite scary. We did have some of these issues in 2000 when George W. Bush ran against Al Gore in places like Florida, for example, some intimidation at polling places. But I think that the answer to that is the local police force has got to make it its number one priority to protect poll workers and make sure that they feel safe from the first minute they show up in the morning, sometimes 6 a.m., to the minute they leave after 9 p.m. And we've seen a successful case where poll workers in Georgia successfully sued for damages against people who are defaming them. And you don't want this to happen in America. We see this all around the world. We just saw this in Venezuela. We do not want this to happen. And it's really up to all of us to pay attention and show respect to our poll workers when we go to vote.
Your legacy.
I don't think in terms of legacy yet. I'm sure I'll have to start doing that in the years to come. I hope that I was a good teacher. I do get feedback from former students, and it is typically positive, but I guess the ones that didn't like me wouldn't stay in touch. I still have a good sense that I have contributed in a positive way to the students that I have taught in my years at Brown. And I think that would be my strongest legacy.
As a final note of optimism, what would you say to all the biologically childless women who are participating actively in this election?
I would say that no matter who you are and what you perceive your own identity to be, how society treats you, you can't make a difference sitting on your couch. Your government won't change. Your life won't change. That's true in every realm. And this is something that people die for in other countries around the world still. And we have the privilege of doing it safely. And I think we really want to get our numbers up. We were really high in 2020, partly through mail voting, but also 2016. A lot of states in the West are all mail voting, for example. But whether it's mail voting or early voting or just making sure on election day that you cast your vote, make sure that you register to vote now. If you're not already registered, you still have time, plenty of time. And your voice, as you know from this podcast, cannot be heard if you do not speak loudly. And voting is speaking loudly.
The Resa wrap-up. Special thanks to Professor Wendy Schiller for joining me in conversation in this very important period, Civic Health Month. As Wendy states, you cannot make a difference sitting on your couch. And we're not just talking about voting. I'm speaking out to all of us in healthcare. A healthy civic environment can contribute to the overall health of society by fostering social support networks, reducing stress, and promoting a sense of purpose and belonging. physicians should not only diagnose and treat illness, but also advocate for social reforms to improve the overall health conditions of people and society at large. Medicine's role extends, therefore, beyond individual health to actually address societal issues, emphasizing that social and political conditions significantly impact public health. A quote I'm going to read for you: "Medicine is a social science, and politics is nothing else but medicine on a large scale." That's all I have for you this week, audience. See you next time. The Visible Voices podcast amplifies voices in the healthcare, equity, and current trends spaces. We are a production of the People's Media Network. Our team includes Dr. Giuliano DePortu and me, Dr. Resa E. Lewis. Please find me through my website and on social media, Resa E. Lewis, MD, or through the podcast, thevisiblevoicespodcast.com. Please give us a 5-star rating on Apple or wherever you listen to podcasts. Also, please be sure to share the show with a friend. The views and opinions expressed by the host and guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the opinion of the institution with which they are affiliated or identified. Information herein should never be used as a substitute for clinical judgment or for medical advice.